Hello, hello, hello. All right, we are in our next lecture. Um, we are still, we're still on reform, and we did both on reform in America. We have two lectures so far, but now for the last lecture of the week, we are focusing on women and change. All right. So what we're gonna do with this one is get into basically the birth of feminism. And our key points today are the cult of domesticity, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Margaret Fuller, and Sojourner Truth. All right, so we have our key points and what we're getting into and what we're focusing on with the birth of feminism really needs to start with this idea of coverture. Coverture is a European ideal, an ideology that focuses on how women are subjugated to men. The man in the relationship, in the marriage, is the authority, and the women are there to support. All right. So we have coverture. This is a European ideal that comes from the French, that comes through the English, that comes to America. All right. This is how we view things early on. All right. But also, there is something known as femsoul. All right. Femsoul is the idea when a woman has no man, whether it be a husband, a father, cousins, or any man in control of them. So they have complete authority of themselves. This is rare, very rare in the colonial and early American history, but it does happen. So, from colonial America on into the 1800s, truth be told, the main thing is coverture. The idea of marrying into and getting a husband and that husband controlling things. All right. The next thing we need to talk about is our first key point. The first key point is the cult of domesticity. All right. Catherine Beecher, Beecher, she creates, she writes what's known as the treatise on the domestic economy. All right. Catherine Beecher believes that a woman's place is in the home and pushes the idea that it is the woman's place in the home that creates the family and makes a better world. All right. This cult of domesticity starts in 1841, and it is where we first get, and it first moves into the modern era of the father goes out to to get the bacon and come home and take care of everybody. And it's the woman's place in the home to take care of all of that. All right. So, with this, this cult of domesticity that comes from this industrialization and urbanization of America and moving into the modern idea of gender roles. So, with this, the woman's role in America during this time is that they are supposed to be obedient, sexually pure, religious and moral, gentle and kind, and nurturing. All right. The whole focus of this is the idea of the woman at home taking care of both their man and their child, and their kids. All right. And it comes from Catherine Beecher and this cult of domesticity. This new push in the gender roles that the woman is supposed to be in the domestic. All right. Okay. Also, we need to talk about the women that kick off something different than the cult of domesticity. Margaret Brent, back in the 1600s, is considered the proto-American feminist. She started up a feminist plantation system where women were working together to create an agricultural benefit for all. And she tried to vote, she tried to push all kinds of pro-women ideals. None of them worked, but she is one of the first. And this is in colonial America. All right. And then moving a little bit forward, we have Anne Hutchinson, which is another proto-feminist. She pushed the idea of self-interpretation of the Bible. The Puritans of New England rejected her and pushed her out. So she went to Rhode Island and founded something new. And that would be where she would actually die. We also have Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft is a feminist from England. Her major work is A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In Europe, it wasn't taken seriously, but the founding mothers and founding fathers here in the late 1700s would take it very seriously and read it and take it to heart, and it would make an impact. And we also have Judith Sargent Murray, who would become our first major American feminist. Through her essays, through her writings, she would push the idea of women's rights. Right? So, by the time we get to Jeffersonian America, Jacksonian America, into the 1800s, what was women's rights? What was the place of the woman? Where did they fit in the economic, social, legal, and political infrastructure of the in the country? They didn't have a say in economic, social, legal, or political, but the whole idea was that they would raise and create the next generation of men that would run everything. So that's where their importance was. And that's where their importance lied during the early 1800s, in the idea that they were creating that next generation of country builders. All right. But to them, that's not going to be enough. All right. With that, let's move into the birth of feminism. All right. And our first person that we're going to talk about, and our first key point, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the mother of a movement, the mother of American feminism, the mother of, the best way to put it, she is the mother of modern feminism. European, Western, American, however you want to look at it. She is the birth of the push of women's rights, the birth of what would become known as feminism. All right. The first thing that comes out of her that makes a major impact and reshapes human culture, not just American culture, is the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. All right. This is considered to be the rewrite and the better version of the Declaration of Independence. All right. This one opens up the idea of all mankind is equal, and all mankind has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not just white men. So Stanton puts forth in this Declaration of Rights and Sentiments this idea. It first emerges in one of the most important congregations and meetings in the mid-century of the 1800s. At Seneca Falls in New York, you have the first major women's rights meeting, and this is where she presents it. This is where she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton become just hardcore interlocked sisters. And these two women from 1848, 1850s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, when Stanton dies, and with Anthony on into the aughts of the 20th century, where she finally dies, they fight for women's rights. It's slow going, as you can still see in the world around us. All right. But Stanton, our first key point, this is a major push. The mother of a movement, what she created with the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments is basically the text of feminism, because it moves past just what it means to have a right as a man, but what it means to have a right as a human being. All right. We also have Lucretia Coffin Mott. All right. She is another one that plays a big role. Like Stanton, she got her start in the temperance movement, but would roll over into many other things: temperance, women's rights, abolitionism, and she would be a major player in abolitionism and women's rights. So you can look into her. We also have Lucy Stone. Um, uh, as far as, you know, individuals that I've read about and looked into, she's one of my favorites. She is a petite, tiny woman, um, much like John Madison, but smaller, but of a huge, huge intellect and huge compassion that would fight for women's rights and African American rights. We also have the Grimke sisters, Angela and Sarah. These are what many people in history refer to as the Southern Avengers. And like with some of these others, with the assignment that you're going to do next week, starting on Monday, you will read about them and read some of the things they wrote and kind of get a glimpse into the intellectual importance and how they would shift America from a male dominated society and talk about women's rights. So, one of the things, one of the most popular things that these two women wrote were the legal disabilities of women. All right. Next, the next key point is Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller is considered one of the most brilliant minds in American history, period. You'll hear how people focus on Jefferson and call him the most brilliant president. In historical circles, Margaret Fuller is considered one of the most important intellectual minds, period, in American history. She's a transcendentalist. She was a teacher throughout most of her life and focused on the idea of transcendentalism, the idea of perfecting oneself, of creating oneself, of creating one's country, creating one's society. Her most significant work in the modern era is Woman in the 19th Century. Like I said, she was a huge influence. She probably would have been even more and more important than she was, but she died in a boat wreck when she was like 40. So, we have Fuller. To me, intellectually speaking, and as a transcendentalist approach, and with how important the ideas of Americanism is, she is a key figure. She is one of the most important women outside of Stanton and Anthony in the 1800s. All right. We also have people like Amelia Bloomer that pushed for women's rights. And I'm sure you've heard of the idea of bloomers, the idea of pants for women under skirts. So you'd have pants under skirts. This would become a big thing in the 1800s. It was not accepted. Women were supposed to be in dresses, not in long pants. This was a physical push in a new direction. Also, we have Dorothea Dix. Dix was born in 1802. She would die in 1807. She would be one of the major philanthropists of the 1800s. She was born into an extremely wealthy family and would keep pushing her wealth into medical research and help people. However, she is much like Catherine Beecher with the cult of domesticity. She believed the woman's place was in the home rather than in the world around. All right. And we also have Sojourner Truth. All right. This is the last individual that I will focus on for this lecture. Sojourner Truth was born in New York City as Isabella Baumfree. She was born into slavery. She was a domestic slave in the house of the family. And it's in this family that she would mature. She would marry, she would have kids, and most of her kids would be traded off into the South. And this is an important thing to push. And during the 1800s, you get a lot of ideas and a lot of promotion of the idea that slavery was just in the South. This woman was born and raised in New York City. All right. With this, she married, had kids, and most of them were sold off into the South. It shows how not only the South was guilty of this horrid crime of slavery, but so was the North. All right. Though she was born as Isabella Baumfree, she would take up the name of Sojourner Truth. All right. Sojourner Truth has a meaning. A sojourn is a journey, a religious journey. Truth, you have it in the word. So she was on a religious journey for truth. She would spend most of her life preaching in the North and the South to African Americans. During this time, she was accepted in the North and South as a preacher of Christianity. And that's how it would work. As the 1800s would move along, she would become more and more involved in pushing for anti-slavery. And once she did, she would be pushed out of preaching in the South, but she'd still preach the ideas of freedom. Also, with the narrative of Sojourner Truth, which was her autobiography and many other things, she would push not only anti-slavery, but women's rights. She gives us one of my favorite speeches in American history. and it's called Ain't I a Woman? Look it up on YouTube or wherever you want. I really encourage everyone to listen to it, to look it up, to go through everything, to go through it. It's a beautiful speech pushing the idea of how African Americans are also human. All right. So, we have the rise of the feminists. But, we also have other things. All right. Also, during this time, you have a profession which women could lead independent lives. You have a profession where women could make more than 3 times a week what a man could make in that week during the 1800s. What do you think that profession is? What do you think the profession is where a woman can lead and live her own life without male control and make more than 3 times what they could make in the best situation? What is that profession? What do you think? Well, that profession is prostitution. All right. This has been, this was the main female occupation in Western world history where a woman could control and live her own life and do her own thing without male control, outside of selling herself. Right? So, with this profession, these women would control, influence, and have a major say in economics and politics wherever they were. Until the Civil War, women controlled prostitution. There were no such thing as pimps. Women controlled things. Most likely, you guys never saw Gunsmoke. It's a TV show that would run from the 50s through the 70s and would be a major show, a Western show, all the way into the 1980s. And it would push this idea of Marshall Dillon as the lawmaker, and you'd have all these other things, but you'd also have Miss Kitty that would run the whores, that would run the prostitutes, that would run things. Women controlled it. It wouldn't be until the Civil War where women would lose the control of their sexuality in the prostitution, where men would take over. And we'll take that up later. But during the 1800s, before the Civil War, and even after the Civil War, when there were battles over the control of women's bodies and prostitution, the major women that would focus on this and be major madams and control prostitution would be people like Jenny Rogers, Maddie Silk, Lou Graham, and Eleanor Dumont. These women would be huge and heavy hitters and major political figures out west. All right? And they would have major influence and say and government in the states in which they lived. All right. So, working women, prostitutes, and their madams would have major say in economies out west as America went west and grew. All right. They would have influence in town building, in state building, in politics. All right. So women would have major says in many numerous ways in the 1800s. Not only would you have this prostitution, but you would have, women like Stanton, like Susan B. Anthony, like Lucy Stone, and Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters. All of these women, whether they were pushing for political rights, economic rights, however you looked at it, women in the 1800s were moving to have a say. Right? And as we go along in this semester, and we'll talk about it, two of the ones I will focus on, of course, are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony will focus on women's rights in politics to vote, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton will focus on and push for women's rights as far as legalities, economics, that if a person dies, they will be able to inherit the property, those kind of things. So that's what we will move forward with women's rights as we go along in this semester. So we've got Women and Change. We have this push that women should be included in that idea of all men are created equal. For them, especially with people like Susan B. Anthony, what it means with all men are created equal means all mankind. Not just white dudes. When you have that statement of all men are created equal, that means all Americans are created equal. And she would push this her entire life. She would fight for this her entire life. Susan B. Anthony would fight and vote and be arrested for trying to vote because she's a woman. But the entire time she pushes this idea that women should be able to vote and have the say in politics, the same as men. So, we have Women and Change. We can go into this in different ways. If you have any questions, let me know. And we'll start up with the next lecture next week. Everybody have a good day. Stay safe, stay healthy. In other words, good night and good luck.